The Middle East is at a turning point. Old alliances are shifting and new power centers are rising. From Turkey's new ties with its neighbors to the high-level talks in Syria, everyone is asking, what comes next? Joining us is veteran analyst Tom Gross. Tom is known for finding the real story behind the headlines and the narrative gap in Gaza. I am Randa Jibai. Today we look at the future of our region. Is it more war or a new map of power? Welcome, Tom. Tom, the world is watching Iran. Tensions are high. Do you see a direct strike coming soon, or will both sides step back?
Well, that's a very important but difficult question to answer. I don't think anybody knows other than President Trump, and I'm not even sure that President Trump knows. For sure, the US military have made plans to go ahead and strike if Trump orders. But Trump is, he likes a victory, but he likes a quick victory. He's not a war president. He doesn't want troops on the ground. He doesn't want to get involved in some long conflict. If you look at any military strike he's done to date, they were very short. He took the president of Venezuela, but did not go further than that in a military action that took a few hours. He bombed some Islamists in Nigeria, again, a few hours. And he, at the very end of Israel's 12-day war against the Iranian nuclear program last June, America joined in. Again, it was a couple of strikes really lasting an hour or two right at the end. So the present situation, if Trump wants to do something meaningful, it's almost impossible for him to do something very, very quickly. And his problem is that what he doesn't want is to leave a situation of chaos. In other words, either he wants to damage the regime so badly that they will give up power, or give up its nuclear program. What he doesn't want to do is damage the regime in the hope that the population of Iran may rise up against the Islamic regime, but without any certainty they will be successful. And you have a situation like after President Obama and Britain and France intervened in Libya in 2011, and really until now, there's a lack of stability and good governance in Libya. So Trump doesn't want to be leaving office in a couple of years with Iran in turmoil. So to answer your question, I think Trump would like to do something, but I think he definitely prefer to cut some kind of deal with the Islamic regime, but I'm not sure the regime is willing to do any kind of meaningful deal. And then Trump has to worry. He doesn't want to lose face. He doesn't want to be remembered as Obama is, who promised his so-called red line against the Assad government after Assad used chemical weapons in Syria. And then forevermore, historians will say, well, if Obama had acted more strongly, maybe the Syrian civil war would not have gone on for all those more years, and hundreds of thousands of people died and millions of people fled to Turkey and into Europe and so on. So I don't think anyone knows, and I don't think Trump knows, and that's why he hasn't done anything yet.
We hear reports of splits in the Iranian leadership. Is the regime starting to crack, or is it stronger than it looks?
Well, I have no doubt that the Iranian regime will not last forever, and in fact it won't last that much longer. And I think one of the breaking points was that Israel, in the 12-day war last June, showed the weakness of the Iranian leadership to the Iranian public. I mean, if the regime can't protect itself, off the top of my head, I believe Israel assassinated the head of the Revolutionary Guards, the head of the army, the key nuclear scientists involved with the weaponization of the nuclear program. It wasn't just scientists, it was those involved with the weaponization. Pinpoint accuracy, very few civilian casualties in doing so, incredible intelligence. And Israel is a small country, Iran is about 10 times bigger population, much bigger area. So I think this was probably a humiliation for the leadership, and it also showed the population who oppose those parts of the population of Iran that oppose the regime, and I think it's a clear majority, it shows that the Islamic regime is not quite as strong as it pretends to be. So I don't think the Islamic regime is going to last. But there's a question here, because other countries that got rid of terrible political systems, there was a clear leader in waiting. For example, in South Africa, Nelson Mandela; in the Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, and there are other cases. Now, there is the Crown Prince, Pahlavi, but the Iranian opposition are very, very divided over Pahlavi, and without naming which station, an Iranian opposition station, there was a fist fight, a punch-up between journalists a few days ago, between people who support the restoration of the monarchy and people who are against the regime, but they're against the monarchy. So even if the regime collapses, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have a stable government. You have another situation like we have in Syria, where the Assad regime fell very quickly at the end, but Hurrah, the present president, he had a military force behind him, and he had a big country, Turkey, sort of aiding him from behind, and that made it much more possible for him to take over. It's not clear without some military backup if protesters in Iran can take over. So, final thing I'll say on this, the most likely immediate regime change, I regret to say, would be somebody within the Revolutionary Guards taking over in a coup, but not necessarily becoming a, let's say, for people who remember Mikhail Gorbachev, he was a reform communist within the Soviet Union. He came to power, but then he kind of he put the Soviet Union out of existence. So you could have some general takeover in Iran, and that general could become, I don't know, like Ataturk in Turkey, somebody who sort of modernizes the country, brings it into the West, and tries to move it towards democracy. But equally, you could have some general in the Revolutionary Guards who's going to be an absolutely ruthless dictator take over.
Would the Iranian people ever accept a government led by the Revolutionary Guard?
Oh, absolutely. The population, the ones who have been protesting against the Islamic regime, will absolutely not accept some, Revolutionary Guards regime that's hardly any different. It just has a different head. The problem is that in countries where the regime has money and weapons and is ruthless and is willing to kill, as we have seen in the last weeks in Iran, it is incredibly difficult to overthrow such a regime without some foreign intervention, and doing it from the air, okay, is probably not enough. Airstrikes can damage the regime. So if Trump does a lot of airstrikes, he can severely damage the regime. But we're talking about 200,000 or 300,000 Revolutionary Guards. So they'll be replaced. It's not enough just to use airstrikes, and there is no appetite at all. There is no chance at all that Trump wants to put any kind of troops on the ground, and nor does any other country. So, even if they dropped a few or smuggled a few light arms in to protesters, I'm not sure they can overthrow the regime. If you look like a country like North Korea, the regime is hated, and millions of people died in North Korea, but you can't overthrow a regime. If the Iranian regime have support of, let's say, 5 or 10% of the population, and then they have hundreds of thousands of armed militia who are very well armed, what are protesters meant to do? It's incredibly difficult. So it's a very unpredictable situation. Another factor is a lot of other countries, although they want to see the regime go, I'm talking about the Gulf Arab countries, in fact, most other countries, I don't think there are many people in the world that like the regime in Iran, certainly not Iranians. Maybe Russia and China see some benefit from it, but I don't think hardly anyone in the Arab world, and Israel and Turkey, none of them want this Islamic regime to stay in place. The problem is they also don't want chaos. You don't want a sort of absolutely chaotic civil war and millions of refugees pouring out and all kinds of, enriched uranium going missing and being put in suitcase dirty bombs. And, so there are all kinds of risks involved here. So just to go back again to your very initial question, even if Trump does something, it might be what we call performative. It might be something where he can claim to his audience, well, I taught them a lesson, I smacked them good, I destroyed this and that. But it's not really any meaningful change. It's something that's just for Trump to go on TV and claim he's done something without actually doing anything particularly long term to change the government.
The 12-day war last summer hit Iran hard. How much did it weaken them, and what is Israel's plan now?
Israel has apparently sent messages through Vladimir Putin in Russia that it does not want some big confrontation. Prime Minister Netanyahu's envoy used Putin, who has good relations with Iran, as a go-between because they don't want a miscalculation. Israel's interests in the first interest of Israel is that Iran no longer has a nuclear weapons program, because nuclear weapons could really be used to wipe Israel off the map. So it's an existential threat. Israel's a tiny country, and the Iranian regime has repeatedly said it wants to destroy Israel. And therefore, the number one interest of Israel is that the regime does not get nuclear weapons. The number two interest of Israel is that it has friendly relations with some new government, and it's a democracy, and as indeed it did have, Iran, fairly good relations with Israel before the 1979 revolution. And indeed, Iranians tend to be, I'm not talking about the government, but ordinary Iranians tend to be relatively sympathetic to Jews in general and Israel and so on. So I'm sure Israel would like a new government, but Israel doesn't seek some all-out war, if only because Israel's kind of exhausted. As everybody knows, there's been 2.5 years of war with Hamas in Gaza, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Houthis in Yemen, and various other strikes. And the population of Israel is exhausted. And there's no real benefit for Israel to have an all-out war. Having said that, if Israel is asked by the United States to somehow assist quietly behind the scenes because they've got very good intelligence and so on, I'm sure they will assist the United States in, targeting or finding opposition members. Maybe Israel knows people within the Revolutionary Guards. It's possible that there are people inside the Revolutionary Guards working with Israel in order to overthrow their own government. So I'm sure Israel will share intelligence with the United States, but I don't believe Israel wants to take any kind of lead in a conflict at all. Israel wanted to set back the nuclear program, and it did last summer.
What about the proxies? Can they still fight together to support Iran?
So you're talking about military strategy or communication strategy?
Military.
Military. Well, Hezbollah definitely would like to hit Israel, but Hezbollah are greatly weakened, by the Beeper attacks and so on. And Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, was killed by Israel during the war. And Hezbollah are, a pale shadow of itself. Hezbollah lost their main sponsor, which was the Assad government in Syria. They can't so easily get new weapons from Iran because the government of Syria is stopping this. The government of Syria does not like Hezbollah because Hezbollah fought with Assad against ordinary Syrians during the civil war. So the government of Syria is does not want to help Hezbollah. And I think most of the Lebanese people and government would rather Hezbollah became a normal political party and integrated themselves into the government. No country wants a militia that's almost as powerful as its own army, which has one foot in Lebanon but one foot in Iran. No country could exist with another military as big as its army and well-funded. So I don't think Hezbollah are nearly as strong as they were before the Israel-Hezbollah war in about a year or so ago, but Hezbollah are not completely finished. They still exist. They're trying to rearm and so on. They may try to fire some rockets if Iran and Israel are fighting again, and so might the Houthis. But Israel will deal with that. I mean, Israel has very good intelligence as to where Hezbollah weapons and rockets are, and it will be easier for Israel to target missile launchers in Lebanon than it is for Israel to target them in Iran, only because they're so much closer. You don't have to fly. It's quite a long route to fly to Iran. So yes, the Houthis and Hezbollah and even Hamas are not completely finished. Hamas are rebuilding in Gaza. I'm sure all three of those proxies would like to join Iran in any war in Israel, against Israel, but only the Houthis are really in a position to do something. And again, it's harder for Israel to hit the Houthis because, they don't have such good intelligence in Yemen and it's further away.
President Erdogan is visiting Saudi Arabia and Egypt right now. What is Turkey's long-term goal for the region?
Well, Turkey's ambitious, or Erdogan is ambitious. If we step back a little bit, if we go back 20 years for a moment, I think Turkey wanted to join the European Union. Turkey's both a European and an Asian Middle Eastern country. And I think Turkey was very oriented to try and join the European Union. And essentially, the European Union has rejected Turkey, either because they think the population is too big or not sufficiently economically prosperous, or Turkey might say because there may be some racists in the European Union that don't want, tens of millions more Muslims in the European Union. Whatever the reason is, because Europe has not welcomed the European Union, and during that time, other smaller countries, former communist countries, were welcomed into the EU, and Turkey was like, hang on a second, we applied before them, we were higher in the queue, we feel rejected. So I think that's one reason that Turkey turned back again towards the Middle East and wants to re-establish itself as a great Middle Eastern power, as it was historically under the Ottoman Empire until World War I. Certainly, President Erdogan has such dreams. I'm not sure if other Turkish leaders do, but the President Erdogan does. And he is playing all sides. Turkey's in a very interesting position because it's also a member of NATO. It manages to keep good relations with both Ukraine and Russia. It keeps diplomatic relations with Israel while also being quite anti-Israeli. It wants to be involved in the so-called Board of Peace that Trump wants to set up in Gaza. So it wants a foot in Gaza. He's in Saudi, as you say, today, but he also, Erdogan, wants better relations with the Egyptians. He's involved in, I think, Libya and other countries. So Turkey has regional ambitions. I'm sure that Turkey would like the Islamic Republic of Iran to be weaker because that gives Turkey bigger opportunities to be stronger. I'm not sure they want the regime to go, but, Turkey, also with Syria, Turkey would like to be the de facto sort of sugar daddy or sponsor of the government in Syria. However, the Turks are quite happy for the Saudis to pay for a lot of reconstruction in Syria. I imagine that Erdogan is working something out with the Saudis on that. But maybe they're also coordinating about Iran because, there could be a war any moment from Iran, or there could be a revolution even without Trump's intervention. The population of Iran are furious and seething. There may be plots going on right now within the power structures of Iran to make internal coups. So I think it's responsible of the Turks and Saudis to try and be on the same page to coordinate on these matters. But I don't think it's some warm love or something. I think it's just responsible meeting of minds or trying to coordinate positions.
How did the war in Gaza affect the Abraham Accords? Did it break the peace or did the agreement survive the test?
Okay, so I don't think the Gaza war has undermined the Abraham Accords almost at all. And many people who don't like Israel or don't like President Trump's foreign policy or don't like the Abraham Accords themselves or don't like the closeness with the UAE and Israel, they would love to have seen this war, this brutal, horrible war we've seen in the last 2 years, damaged the Abraham Accords. And as far as I can see, they haven't done damage to them at all. For example, just to remind people, the Abraham Accords with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and to a lesser extent, Sudan. So 1 week ago, I flew from Dubai to Tel Aviv. And I was lucky enough to be in the business lounge because someone paid for me. And there in this business lounge were mixing, because there were several airlines using it, mixing Orthodox Israeli Jews, Muslims with traditional attire, everyone getting on. It was all fine, okay? On a previous trip, a week earlier, I was in Abu Dhabi, and I read when I was there that Etihad, the national airline of Abu Dhabi, now flies 6 times a day to Tel Aviv. Both Abu Dhabi and Israel are small countries. That's 42 flights a week, more, I understand, than any other airline. Then you have, and of course, you also have dozens of flights from Dubai every day to Tel Aviv. I'm just giving an indicator that hundreds of thousands of people are visiting. There's trade, there's tourism. In Abu Dhabi 2 years ago, there's something called the Abrahamic House, which the Emir built, which has a mosque, a church, and a synagogue. There's hardly any security necessary. There are people praying in all 3 parts of that building. You don't see this so easily in London or Paris, where synagogues now need security. Okay, you don't see that level of security in Abu Dhabi as you do in Western Europe. So in terms of trade, in terms of agricultural tech, in terms of desalination, in water desalination, in terms of tourism and various other fields, relations are good, certainly between Morocco and Israel and the UAE and Israel. Then we come to the point of why haven't other big countries joined the Abraham Accords recently? Well, first of all, some non-Arab countries have. Kazakhstan just joined, and Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan are about to join. But the answer to why Saudi Arabia has not joined yet, or Kuwait, I think that's not because of the Gaza war. That's because the Crown Prince, MBS, was very closely working with Donald Trump and Trump's advisors such as Jared Kushner and others. And when Biden won the 2020 election, just after, the Abraham Accords came into effect just before Trump left office, right at the end of 2020, and then Biden came in January 21, I don't see any push by Biden to continue the Abraham Accords because Biden said, we don't like MBS, because of the Washington Post journalist. They blamed him for ordering his killing. And, the new administration was not keen to work with the Saudis. And then there was COVID. It was hard to travel for a couple of years because of the COVID virus and so on. So the fact that Saudi Arabia didn't join the Abraham Accords was more to do with the fact Biden was in office. And I think Saudi Arabia will join the Abraham Accords. They're waiting for the right moment. And it's been delayed now, as I understand, because of rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE about Yemen. So Saudi Arabia has slightly distanced themselves from Israel, but it's not because they suddenly decided to support the Palestinian cause in Gaza, which they have not been supporting for the last 2 years. It's more to do with power plays to do with the UAE and Yemen. And I think they will join at some point. Now, also you have Syria. It's quite possible that in some form or other, Syria will join the Abraham Accords. And that was, of course, unthinkable before the new government came into effect. I'm not saying they will, but the fact it's even being talked about is something. So in answer to your question, people who want to pressure Israel, especially in the West, would like to see Israel be isolated internationally. But I see very, very little change between relations between the Arab governments and Israel. I mean, no government has broken relations. Egypt and Jordan haven't either. And, governments like Qatar that are close to Hamas and Iran, and in fact, Israel killed a couple of Hamas people in Qatar. And even though Qatar does not have officially relations with Israel, they seem to speak to each other at a high level almost every few days, having some summit, as close as ever. So I'd say that Israel has got fairly good relations at this point with the vast majority of Arab countries, and in time they will also join the Abraham Accords, I believe.
In your view, when is the right moment for Saudi Arabia to join the peace process?
I think it depends on domestic issues within Saudi or on Saudi-American relations. I don't think Israel and Saudi Arabia have actually had quiet behind-the-scenes contacts, I understand, as far back as the 1950s and 60s. There've been intelligence and so on. I understand, although there's no evidence, but I understand from good sources that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and the Crown Prince, MBS, have met directly on at least 2 occasions in 2 different venues. So it's not that Israel and Saudi Arabia don't already have a certain amount of behind-the-scenes cooperation, but it also depends on domestic Saudi. Saudi Arabia is going through a process of reform, of opening up, of maybe moving away from being so Islamic, giving somewhat more rights to women and more tourism and opening up. And I think that, having relations with Israel will fit into that pattern when they're ready. But I don't think there's any particular rush. They don't need to rush, and nor does Israel. And indeed, one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia wanted to be closer to Israel is they wanted Israel to kind of protect them against any threat from the Islamic regime in Iran. And in a way, they don't need Israel to do that anymore because Israel has all now damaged the regime. And I'm pretty sure that even though Saudi Arabia claims they won't let Israeli jets, fighter jets go through their airspace and so on, I imagine there is quite a lot of coordination behind the scenes, actually.
We have seen Syria and Israel negotiating for months. Where are those talks now?
No, there are quiet talks. Look, it's very different. Syria and Israel share a border. They share all kinds of vital issues. And it makes sense for the 2 countries. I mean, it would be better if they actually had a proper peace agreement. But even if they don't have a peace agreement, it's important they talk to reach understandings on all kinds of issues. And I believe that on and off such talks have happened in Paris. They've happened in, I think, Baku and Azerbaijan. Sometimes they're indirect through the Trump administration and so on. No, I believe there are talks going on, but, they'll want to keep them quiet, and it's good that they keep them quiet. They're more likely to, one of the reasons the Abraham Accords worked in 2020 is because they kept the media away. They kept people like you and myself away. And I'm not sure, if there's too much heat, it becomes politically hard, not only for Hurrah in Syria, but in Israel. People don't quite understand. There is a Druze population in Israel and a Druze population in Syria, also in Lebanon. And the Druze population in Israel actually are quite an important political lobby inside the Israeli Knesset. And they are very anti-Hurrah because they say he's an Islamist and he won't protect the Druze, and he's allowed some of his troops to attack and murder Druze and other minorities, Christians and Kurds and elsewhere. So there's a kind of pressure, and a lot of the Druze in Israel support the Likud party, the party of Netanyahu. There's internal pressures within Israel also not to be too close to Hurrah. But I suspect both Hurrah and Netanyahu, they've got policy advisors coordinating with each other, I'm sure.
UAE and Morocco have built strong ties with Israel. But what about Bahrain? Where do they stand now?
It always was less, but that's because they're worried about the Iranian regime. The majority population of Bahrain is Shia, and Iran, or rather the Iranian regime has its fingerprints all over the place, and the Bahraini government has to be cautious. But it's not as warm as the UAE, but nor is it cold. I mean, again, I travel a lot around the Middle East. I've also flown from Bahrain to Tel Aviv a little while ago, and things are normal. There's nothing weird or special about it. So Bahrain does not have as close relations. It's not as important as Dubai and Abu Dhabi are very important. They're very important generally now for world economics and international forum. So Bahrain is not as warm, but there's less to cooperate between Bahrain and Israel. There's less reason for them to be close. But again, there's a synagogue functioning in Bahrain now. They haven't cut relations. I mean, I would say Bahraini relations are probably better than some of the Jordanian and Egyptian relations with Israel, because Jordan has a big Palestinian population. And in Egypt, for one reason or other, there's a lot of anti-Israel articles and so on in the Egyptian media. And I would have thought that Egypt and Jordan, the two countries Israel's had relations with for much longer, although there's good security cooperation between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, it's not exactly warm feeling in tourism or in other fields. So not like there is with UAE and Morocco, where there was really a good feeling between Israelis and people in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And in Bahrain, I think it's probably better feeling than it might be in Egypt, for example.
Is there a real gap between what Arab governments want and what their people feel about peace with Israel?
Well, people say that about Saudi Arabia. I don't believe that's the case with the people in Morocco or in the Gulf. I mean, there's no, without putting it bluntly, there's no particular love for the Muslim Brotherhood among many people in Morocco and Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Hamas are the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't get the impression there is particular sympathy for the Palestinian cause among the public of Morocco, not like there might be in Egypt or Jordan. So it's a factor. I don't think any of these governments can move ahead without taking into account public opinion. And it may be a factor in Saudi Arabia, but it's a cynical regime in Saudi Arabia, and they can manipulate their own public opinion. And I don't think public opinion is the reason one way or the other whether they do a deal with Israel. I think they'll do a deal with Israel when they think they can extract concessions from the United States and from Israel. I don't think the government in Saudi Arabia is so careful about public opinion that it will dress it up how it likes. And of course, if Saudi Arabia joins the Abraham Accords, a whole lot of other countries may join at the same time. They're waiting for Saudi Arabia. It's also a bit more complicated in Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia has custodianship of Mecca and Medina, and then you have the Al-Aqsa compound in Jerusalem. And I believe Saudi Arabia asked Israel if Saudi Arabia could also have control over that instead of Jordan, which Jordan doesn't like. So it's all a bit more complicated. They may be trying to extract different concessions from Israel. I don't think they're too worried about their own public opinion.
You often talk about the narrative gap in the media. Where is the Western press getting the Gaza story wrong?
Well, okay, let's look at the role of the media. So militarily, Hamas are, of course, much weaker than Israel and always have been. The Israeli army is much, much stronger than Hamas. So Hamas had to use whatever weapons it could. And one weapon is public opinion and the media. In other words, Hamas maybe can't beat Israel militarily. They can damage Israel, they can fire rockets, they can kill people in Israel, and they do. And they've done suicide bombings, but they can't, they're not in a position to actually destroy Israel or something. So what Hamas has done is utilize media and other public opinion to try and pressure Israel that way. And during this war, they were constantly trying to pressure Israel into ceasefires. before Israel was ready, either by releasing cynical hostage videos or videos that looked like people on the verge of death when they weren't necessarily. The hostages were not necessarily. They deliberately made them look worse to try and manipulate Israeli opinion. Also, I'm not for one moment suggesting that thousands of civilians have died in this war. Palestinian civilians, also some Israeli ones, and of course that's been horrendous. However, Hamas have had a de facto interest to try to exaggerate the number of civilian deaths because it plays into their hands. If they can say Israel's hit a hospital, 500 dead, they can then put pressure, as they did, and I'm talking about a particular occasion when Israel had not hit a hospital. In fact, Islamic Jihad, another Palestinian group, had tried to fire rocket Israel and by mistake hit the hospital car park, and Hamas immediately, and maybe a few people were killed, Hamas immediately put out a statement saying exactly 487 people or whatever had died, as if anyone could possibly count within 20 minutes in the middle of the night how many people had died. And it puts it out to friendly news agencies, not just in Iran or Qatar or Al Jazeera, but also in the West. And those friendly journalists in the West who are eager to say Israel's terrible and Israel's committing genocide and Israel's a terrible country that we in the West shouldn't be, supporting, immediately put it out. And Hamas knows this because if Israel will be under pressure to stop a military action in the middle, if that action is being seen to being much more violent or vicious than it in fact is. So there is a gap between the number of civilians dying and the numbers not. There's also been a gap between, there's been starvation or famine declared at various points in the last year. What Hamas have done is they've invited friendly photographers from international agencies, and they've done photo shoots with poor little children who suffer from things like cerebral palsy and other genetic disorders. And then they have cropped the photos to remove the brothers and sisters of the child who are not starving. And then they've said these kids are starving to death, when in fact they weren't starving to death. And Hamas's own hospital records from a year or two earlier, when these children were born, showed that these children were born with terrible genetic conditions, which I have to say every country has, unfortunately. There's such children like that in Israel and in America and everywhere else. So there's a lot of manipulation of the media, but that's not to say there isn't a lot of genuine suffering and deaths and people living in tents and not enough supplies and so on. There is, for sure. But at the same time, there's also a lot of propaganda. And it's not easy for journalists to report from any war zone, including from Gaza. Nevertheless, this war has shown that a lot of journalists have a lot of their own viewpoints and prejudices, and they have not necessarily been objective journalists. They've taken sides in a way that, journalists are not meant to. And it's not just in Gaza. I'll just make one other small point that I heard the other day. In America, in the past, when some famous news presenter retired, he went into retirement, no one knew his opinions. Today, you have big news presenters like Tucker Carlson, left Fox News, and the other day Don Lemon was arrested, left CNN. These were two of the biggest names on Fox and CNN. And we, the public, know every one of their opinions about everything, okay? So we're living in an age where journalists, instead of being the news reporters or the new anchors, decided to participate from one side or the other with viewpoints. And that puts into question their reliability because they have agendas. So I don't want to say it's only people in Gaza. It's actually a global problem where journalists, and that's one reason a lot of people all over the world, also in the democracies, don't trust the mainstream media anymore. And, I have to commend at this point your station as being one of the few that tries to have fair, objective, balanced, all-round coverage. But too many media do not. And I commend your station and Jeff Gedmin and so on for doing their best to be objective, which is not easy.
Critics say Israel does not have a day after plan for Gaza. Is that a fair point?
Well, that's certainly what, let's say, in Israel, there are many, many different political parties. The Israeli Knesset, the parliament, has 120 seats, and it has about 13 or 14 different parties. So I can say that other than Netanyahu's Likud parties in a coalition, pretty much every other party is saying what you just said. What is the day after strategy? What is your vision? Should you bring in the Palestinian Authority to run Gaza? Should you, try and work with some reformed former Hamas people? Should you try to see if Gaza would become once again part of Egypt, which it was before 1967? So I think that Netanyahu is keeping his cards close to his chest. From what I know, a lot of people say Netanyahu's lost it, he's been in power too long, he doesn't have a proper strategy, he's going day to day, he really doesn't have this vision for anything anymore, he should retire, blah, blah, blah. That is the view of many Israelis and many other people. And personally, I think he probably should retire because I don't think it's good for any leader to be in power for too long. But as long as he's the prime minister, I can confidently say that he's no fool, he's a very strategic leader, and I'm sure he has some ideas of what he'd like. I personally think, and it was floated the other day, that what he'd most like to do is have an arrangement with the United Arab Emirates and for Gaza to, in effect, become an outpost, another emirate of the UAE, and to be a prosperous place that looks a little bit like Jared Kushner's AI-generated model of Gaza looking like it's Abu Dhabi or whatever, which, if it really worked and the people of Gaza could really live in such nice places, I'd say go for it. I mean, who doesn't want to live in nice new blocks and so on? But I'm not suggesting it can come about, but I think Netanyahu would probably like Gaza to have a government, maybe run by a Gazan like Mohammed Dahlan, who's in exile in Abu Dhabi. What Israel would like is a government in Gaza that doesn't want to fire rockets at Israel. There are extremists on the right in Israel that want to occupy Gaza and settle Jews again, but these are maybe 2 or 3% of the population. I think the mainstream view of Israelis is they absolutely do not want to go into Gaza at all, and they just don't want, which is one reason Israel left Gaza in 2006. So I think that it's very hard to achieve, but if you really did have a something like Dubai in Gaza, there's natural gas off the coast of Gaza, the Palestinian population is fairly well educated, fairly skilled, they're engineers and so on, and they're good builders, as we see with all these tunnel networks. So there's no reason that Gaza, it's got a very good stretch of the Mediterranean coast. There's no reason that Gaza shouldn't be a fairly prosperous place as long as it's got a government there that doesn't then want to fight a jihad against Israel and conquer Israel. Israel doesn't want that, clearly. And, it could be like a little Dubai or a little Singapore. I suspect that is what Netanyahu might want. There are others, let's say on the street, that are very angry with the whole population of Gaza because of the October 7 attack, and they just like Gazans to go and live in Egypt or somewhere else, just as there are people in Gaza that would like all Israelis to go and live back in Iraq or Poland or wherever. But I don't think either of these options is, a possibility at all. The population of Gaza is going to stay in Gaza. The population of Israel is going to stay in Israel. So to be honest, I think the best situation is to have something like a little Dubai in Gaza, where the Muslim Brotherhood are not allowed to operate, just like they're not allowed to operate in Dubai, i.e. Hamas. But most people are happy because it's a fairly prosperous place. And, I'll leave with a final thought. After World War II, Germany had invaded its neighbours, including France, 3 times under Bismarck, under World War One and World War Two, 3 times in about 100 years. No one could imagine there'd be open borders between Germany and France and Germany and the Czech Republic and Denmark. Something that seems totally normal today, but it didn't seem normal 80 years ago. I don't see why, as long as there is justice also in the West Bank for the Palestinian population, I don't see why there shouldn't eventually be open borders with Lebanon, Syria and Israel and everywhere else. Obviously, minority rights have to be respected in general in the region, but I don't see why that's an impossible dream. It depends which way the region goes in future. What seems impossible is possible. You know, Europe had 1,000 years of wars, of the 30 Years' War and 100 Years' War. And, you know, by and large, other than Ukraine and other than the former Yugoslavia, peoples of Europe, by and large, get on pretty well today.
From Israel's view, what is the most dangerous red line? Hezbollah, direct war with Iran, or being alone in the world?
Gosh, okay. I think the number one thing that Israel doesn't want, it's very basic, is they don't want rockets just being fired at random on its population, okay? Whether from the Lebanese border or from the Yemen or from Gaza or from Egypt or Iraq or whatever. That is the number one strategic aim of Israel is security, not to be attacked in general by rockets, and especially potentially by ballistic missiles, again from Iran or the Houthis. The Houthis also fired ballistic missiles. That is the number one aim. About its reputation, or about Israel's reputation or Israel's diplomatic relations, like most countries, I'm sure Israel wants a good reputation, wants good diplomatic relations, but it's more important to stay alive. So Israel's more interested in the Hezbollah or the Houthi or Hamas not rearming with rockets. That's more important than, you know, somebody not wanting to participate against Israel in a soccer match, or not wanting to go to some Israeli-owned restaurant in New York. These things are unpleasant, but they cannot compare. As far as diplomatic isolation, actually, I don't think Israel is diplomatically isolated as people think. We spoke already about the Arab world and the Abraham Accords, but if you look at countries like India, you know, it's going to be the biggest population in the world. Israel and India have very close relations. In fact, I just read about an hour before this interview that India has deported 2 British tourists for writing Free Palestine in graffiti in India. So, you know, I don't think India wants to get involved against Israel. And Israel has fairly good behind-the-scenes relations growing with other countries. The Japanese foreign minister was just in Israel, Indonesia behind the scenes, the biggest Muslim population in the world, Argentina, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. So I'm not sure that Israel is more diplomatically isolated than it has been before. And I think those people who are in the public, who are very anti-Israel in the West, make a lot of noise. They make a lot of noise at Columbia University in New York. They make a lot of noise outside the Eurovision Song Contest in Europe. But it's noise. I don't think it's, you know, really affecting that much. It's a minority who are rather obsessed with the one issue of Israel in a way they're not obsessed about the regime in Iran, or they're not obsessed about other issues in the world. And they make a lot of noise, but I don't think they actually force any real isolation. And even governments, 3 of them, that recognized the Palestinian state during the war, I'm not sure what meaning, what effect it really has. It's just in fact, I'd even say it puts back the Palestinian cause, because it gives the illusion of doing something rather than doing the hard work of building up a Palestinian state that will live in peace with Israel and Israel will want as a neighbor. Just declaring it in Ireland or wherever, in Norway, I don't really think that does anything. It's just done for domestic reasons in Ireland or Norway.
How does Israel destroy Hamas but also stop Gaza from becoming a permanent base for Iran?
Well, it's about weapons smuggling. First of all, about weapons smuggling. I don't think Egypt makes it easy to bring weapons in from, I don't think. It's about weapons smuggling, it's about financial smuggling. The Iranian economy is in a very bad state now. One of the protests, one of the chants of the protesters in Iran, it's a widespread chant, is not Gaza nor Lebanon, my heart is with Iran. In other words, stop funding Hamas and Hezbollah. It's nothing to do with us. Look after us, we, the population of Iran, they say to their own Iranian government. Stop wasting all these billions supporting proxy groups in a futile war against Israel that you're not going to win anyway. And, in fact, there's quite a lot of opposition to Palestinian nationalism among the Iranian population, partly because they don't, it's only the Iranian regime that uses as a forward operating base. I don't think there's any appetite among the Iranian public to support that. And I think the Iranian regime is very weak now, so I don't think they've got much potential to do very much other than try and survive.
Thanks a lot, Tom.